Multi-hazards, all about protecting communities.
Hello, everybody. Again, we're here for Multi-hazards. This is a podcast where we take a deep dive into issues in emergency management, climate change adaptation, security, etc. And ultimately, it's all about protecting communities. So welcome. I'm the host, Vin Nelson. Now, on to today's topic. We are privileged to have Dr. Joel Wainwright. So he is professor in the Department of Geography at the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. And he has been the professor there since 2017. Before this, he was visiting associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of British Columbia and Simon Fraser University, which are right near me here in Greater Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And he was there from 2015 to 2016. So his education is as follows. He has a PhD in geography, a minor in sustainable agriculture from the University of Minnesota from 1998 to 2003. He has an MA in geography from the University of Minnesota 1996 to 98, and a bachelor with honors in environmental studies at Bucknell University from 1991 to 95. And he has many honors such as the Sussex Prize for International Theory 2019, and this was from his Climate Leviathan book, which we will talk about. For publications, his books are, and of course with Dr. Geoff Mann, the 2018 book we'll be discussing, Climate Leviathan, a political theory of our planetary future. In 2012, he had a book called Geopiracy, Oaxaca, Militant Empiricism and Geographical Thought. In 2008, he had a book called Decolonizing Development, Colonial Power and the Maya, and many journal articles on topics such as, and I'll just look at some of these that he has produced in the last couple of years. How does the rule of law obtain its space? Justice and racial difference in colonial law, for the International Journal for this semiotic analysis of law. And then he had another one called The Maya and the Belizean State, 1997 to 2004, Reflections on the Indigenous Rights Question after 20 years for Latin American and Caribbean ethnic studies, and many others. So it's my custom here at the Multi-Hazards podcast, because of deep respect for the First Nations on whose land I podcast here in the suburbs of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, to say a territorial acknowledgement. So this is acknowledging the land on which I presently am on. The text is from my neighboring Kwantlen Polytechnic University, or KPU, and here it is. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Quiquetlam peoples. These are the names of various First Nations groups around me here in Greater Vancouver, here on the west coast of Canada. Now, without further ado, let's get to the interview. So welcome. We have Dr. Joel Wainwright here, professor at Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, the United States, and he's given me permission to call him Joel. And to start off with, how are you doing, Joel? You and your family during this crazy COVID-19 time and slow recovery?
I'm doing just fine, Ben. Thank you. It's great to be on your show.
Okay, great. Now, I contacted you because it's funny. I read a lot. I watch a lot of things online. But last summer, the book that you wrote with Simon Fraser University, Professor Geoff Mann, that's where I went like 25 years ago. But it was called Climate Leviathan, a political theory of our planetary future. And I took it out of the Simon Fraser library, and I don't know why. I just thought, another book among my stack of whatever 20 books. But I don't know, it just grabbed me. And I was just thinking, because 20 years ago I had studied all about politics and communication theory at Simon Fraser. So and also we had lots of neo-Marxist theory in the communication department. So you brought up a lot of familiar writers, but it really struck a chord. And I thought, this is something that shouldn't just stay in this book. This is something that should be a springboard, a platform where people just go on in different directions. And now, so that was last summer. It was sort of my hot summer book on the beach. So I'm fascinated that how have these possible governance scenarios, how have they changed, for example, for climate change? And I look at the news, usually cringing at the good, bad, and the ugly, and the politics that's happening in U.S., Canada, and worldwide. See, last year, I even went to this huge climate strike in Vancouver at the end of August when I was reading your book. And then all this pandemic stuff. And now we have public struggles for justice for African Americans, African Canadians, other marginalized communities. So, so this is just a prelude to my question. So in your opinion, how have the themes of Climate Leviathan played out these last couple years, and where does it need to go in a healthy, democratic way?
Oh, that's a great question, Vin. But first of all, let me just say thanks for your hearty endorsement of the book. And I have to say it was a really complicated but fun book to write, in large part because I was working with Geoff Mann, who I'm sure if you were at Simon Fraser today, you would hear from your peers that he's a terrific teacher and a great guy and a brilliant thinker and excellent writer. So for all those reasons, it was really wonderful to write the book. I might also mention, since you're out there in BC, that it is kind of a BC book, because I was living in Vancouver during the year when we wrote most of it. I was on sabbatical that year at UBC and Simon Fraser. So there's a little SFU, more than a little SFU in the book. Now, before I talk about how the themes of Climate Leviathan seem to be playing out in the world right now, it might be helpful if I back up and give a very short précis of what the book is about, what those themes are. But before I even get to that, I have to say, because we're living in this extraordinary moment, and for those who listen to this podcast later, we're speaking on the afternoon of the 8th of June, 2020, about 2 years after the book came out, and in the middle of what can only be characterized as the largest uprising and civil disobedience in U.S. history in the last 50 years. For the last 2 days, I've been in very large protests here in Columbus, Ohio, arguing for justice for George Floyd, trying to make the case with thousands and thousands of other people for radical changes in the way what we call criminal injustice plays out here in the United States, going beyond mere reform of police departments. And all of this is tied up with a conjuncture in which global capitalism is really in a crisis right now. We've got approximately 20% unemployment here in the States today. And of course, this crisis was triggered by, but not fundamentally caused deeply, but triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has gone global, killing now over 100,000 people here in the United States.
Wow.
And so it's difficult to think straight in such moments, frankly. And like many on the left, I spend a lot of my time these days talking with colleagues and comrades and friends and allies, and just trying to get our bearings and get reorientated. And nothing would delight me more than to know that our book, Climate Leviathan, was helping some people out there make sense of these times. And it was, in a sense, in anticipation of such disorientation and such struggles that we wrote it. So what's the book about? In a nutshell, it is a book of political theory. So in that tradition that includes such luminaries as, Aristotle and Hobbes and Hegel and Marx and so forth, but it's a book of political theory that is centered around the question, where is the world going politically given rapid climate change? And so we begin with a presupposition, which is not often shared on the left, and we respect that, but we thought it would be useful as a theoretical exercise. The presupposition is to ask, suppose that humanity does not rise promptly to the challenge of decarbonizing global capitalism. What then will happen politically? And how could we use what exists from the history of political theory to anticipate those changes in such a way that would allow us to map out our options, so to speak, and think ahead from a very radical perspective about how the world would have to be organized politically in order to produce something like a just response to climate change. That was our challenge when we started, and we came to that problem as leftists who were involved in climate issues and as teachers about climate and capitalism who were frustrated, frankly, with the lack of clear thinking on the part of the left and political theory about such things. Certainly a lot of people, practically everyone we knew was talking about this stuff, but there didn't seem to be a lot of books that really squared up to the problem. So we thought, let's try and sketch out some ideas. So that was what we did in the book Climate Leviathan. At the heart of the book is a set of theories about different possible paths the world can move forward on. These paths are not really things. They're more like political, economic, and social scenarios whereby political and economic structures adapt to the massive changes that are already occurring in the world because of climate change and all of its secondary effects. And for various reasons explained in the book, we give them what some people think, and I think legitimately so, are kind of funny names. We call them Climate Leviathan. That's the scenario we think is most likely. Climate Leviathan's main enemy right now is Climate Behemoth. And then there's a third character waiting in the wings from the revolutionary left called Climate Mao. And then there's a fourth scenario, which is the one that, in a sense, we're fighting for, the one that we really genuinely believe most in, but which, if we're honest, is utopian and extremely unlikely. And in fact, for want of a better name, and because a big part of the problem is even coming up with a suitable descriptor, we call it Climate X, where X is like a problem to be solved, like in a math puzzle, solve for X. So with that said, now turning to your question about the themes of Climate Leviathan and where we are today, I would say, and I hope this doesn't sound like a arrogant claim or anything like that, but I would say that, and I won't speak for Geoff on this point, although I kind of think he would agree with me, that we wouldn't really change anything about the book if we were writing it today, other than, of course, to probably, like all writers, exploit the COVID-19 pandemic and perhaps even the uprisings that are occurring here in the United States as a way of catching the reader's attention. But fundamentally, I don't think the analysis would change at all. Because as you know, Vin, having read the book, we state right up front that we think that the world is in a very severe economic, political, and ecological crisis, and that we expect it to get worse and produce massive upheaval. And that, I think, is more or less exactly what we're seeing in the world today. And the question becomes, is it appropriate, as many liberals are wont to do, to assume that this is just like a passing phase and that the liberal capitalist nation state is going to quickly kind of get everything under control and go back to normal and find a way towards sustainable development or something like that? And we think that that's the true utopian position today. The people who think that all of the problems that the world has today are simply going to get kind of swept under the rug of the liberal democratic nation state are the real utopians. And the people who are kind of more honest about what's going on are the ones who recognize that that the combination, I should say, of very severe crises that we see in the world system today portends great change. So we're at the beginning of one of those phases of world history where quite dramatic changes are coming. And the direction that we think things are going is unfortunately towards a form of intensification of global capitalism in response to extremely rapid environmental changes, which are going to throttle ecosystems all over the world even more than we've already seen, as well as human society, even more than has already occurred, and cause all kinds of problems, both direct and secondary. We could see COVID-19 as a secondary illustration because, of course, it's part of the ecology of the world system too, and the very fact that it became a pandemic so quickly is tied up with the organization of our world's political economy.
Mm-hmm.
But to my mind, from where I'm sitting today, having just lived through 2 weeks of the most extraordinary civil unrest and rebellion in, I would say, the last 100 years of U.S. history, I think the more immediate question in the front of my mind is, what about Black Lives Matter? And how does that help us to rethink or extend the arguments we made in the book? And here I'll just make one observation. And since, by the way, these are extremely contentious issues, but also fast evolving, I hope that future listeners of the podcast will recall that I'm speaking off the cuff in the heat of the moment here. This is really kind of like a hot take, not a carefully thought out political theoretical position. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that in the first instance, what Black Lives Matter has done, which is an extraordinary service for everyone in the whole world, but particularly, I think, for those of us on the left and who are interested in liberation and equality struggles here in the United States, is to emphasize that the reforms that are always proposed by liberals to address state violence are inadequate for the more general liberation that would be necessary to bring about something like a genuine democracy. It's a really important political insight that is being lived right now in the streets. We can see it, for instance, in the fact that almost immediately after George Floyd's murder by the 4 police in Minneapolis, the people, first in Minneapolis, South Minneapolis, and then across Minneapolis, Minnesota, St. Paul, and then across the world, came out to the streets to peacefully protest, to assemble, to use their constitutional rights, as we say here in the United States, to gather together and to demand democracy. And what occurred, of course, is that they were met by an extraordinary wave of violence from militarized police. Mm-hmm. So the very thing that they were demanding, namely liberation, was immediately met with its opposite, namely militarized state repression, which was the very thing, of course, which was weaponized by, we might say, white supremacy to murder George Floyd and so many others.
Right.
And yet the protest did not go away. In the face of this, the protest continued all over the place. And in fact, they grew. And so now here we are 2 years into this. What we're being reminded again is that liberation requires constant struggle and levels of organization that go beyond spontaneity. So that's sort of the first immediate thing. The second thing is that it also reminds us of the complexities of the politics of race and class and geography and gender and the way that all the different forms of difference play into these social struggles. Mm-hmm. And one of the arguments that Geoff and I tried to make in the book, although in hindsight I think we could have done better, but nobody's perfect. We'd be the first to try to own up to these self-criticisms, is that there's a lot more that needs to be said about the specific way that the forms of difference that rend our societies and make them so unequal in so many ways make it very difficult to imagine how we could produce something like a just response to climate change. I mean, just to begin with, to state the obvious point, Ben, which I know you know and probably all your listeners, but one of the reasons why climate change is such an enormous social justice issue is because essentially all the carbon emissions are emitted by rich people, and all of the costs of climate change are being experienced by poor people. And so in a way, it's like, I don't think it's much of a moral stretch to say it's the greatest crime since the history of slavery. I mean, the magnitude of the violence that's being caused by rich people for the poor of today and of the future is just almost incalculable. Right. So from this position, then it seems to be pretty clear, like, okay, well, then to get on the side of justice, you have to want to try and decarbonize global capitalism. But that means having to address and build movements with all of the forms of difference that exist today. And that turns out to be very complicated because, for instance, if you are a member of the African American community of South Minneapolis today, you are not going to give climate change your top priority. Your top priority is to get the state police off your neck, quite literally. So what does this mean? This means that anyone who's interested in climate change has to also be interested in the first instance into ending such extreme forms of inequality and state-based violence that make it impossible for us to build a genuinely multiracial, transnational, transclass alliance to confront climate change, and so on. So those are just two brief comments in the wake of the last few days of protests about the relevance of Climate Leviathan.
Now, like I'm a student of disaster management and also climate change adaptation.
That's a growth field, Vin. You have a lot of opportunities for your career in the future.
I hope so. I'm middle-aged too. But there's a lot of parallels because, for example, in disaster science, who are the people who are most vulnerable? It's often the people who have their neck under a police officer's boot.
That's right.
Who has the poorest housing? Who's living in the most hazardous part of town?
Right.
These are marginalized people.
Right.
And then if you look at multi-hazards, it's a theory where, well, a hazard can happen, a disaster can happen consecutively, but they can also happen simultaneously. So, and there was a couple of professors at in London, I think it's the King's College UK, right. Dr. Gill and Dr. Malamu, they wrote about multi-hazard, and basically they were saying that people in disaster management, they need to imagine that if disaster A hits disaster B, and maybe you could even look at it statistically or from a math perspective, but it becomes very complicated and people think, why bother? Why waste the time? But as we've seen with COVID-19 and you probably looked at Canada in the early part of this year, we actually had uprisings for, it was the Wet'suwet'en struggle from British Columbia. Indigenous people were and their allies were blocking railroads all over Canada. So that sort of flared up for a month or two and then it kind of petered out. But a lot of these struggles are coming nowadays because people are just sick and tired of, it's usually white old men who are over 70, and also you could say some baby boomers or pre-boomers who just want to keep things the same. And I don't think, I'm not blaming all of them, but I'm just saying there is a percentage, and it's like, wait a minute, what about all the other people who didn't enjoy the boom that you have enjoyed since World War II? What about the youth who have to breathe your stinky air and they have to live with your crappy economy and your expensive housing? Because I know you lived in Vancouver, you saw it's sky high. Yeah. So
there's certainly a lot more of those struggles should be expected for the future. Let me take off two questions from your remarks, Vin, and see if I can answer them briefly. The first concerns your reference to the combination of those different disasters and the way that they can synergize or produce more complicated negative effects just by interacting in unexpected ways. The language of disaster or hazards is not really what we use in the book. We prefer the language of conjunctural analysis, something we take from the Italian political theorist Antonio Gramsci. But it means more or less the same thing, Vin. The idea is that in history, we have certain patterns and rhythms to different historical processes. For instance, there are economic cycles, political cycles, ecological rhythms, and so forth. And so that means that at any given point in time, to understand the dynamics of what's going on, you have to understand each one of those patterns and processes, but you also have to consider how they interact. And our central claim of the book is that the present world crisis is a type of a conjunctural analysis, which is especially severe, like an organic crisis in Gramsci's terms, whereby we have the combination of an especially deep crisis of global capitalism, an especially deep crisis of global ecology, and that what has yet to come is the full severity of the political crisis. It's kind of apparent in the way that liberalism everywhere is on the ropes. That's what you were, I think, referring to a moment ago when you were implying that the elite of Canada are no longer seen as really legitimate. They no longer have hegemony, in other words. And I think that we can expect that more and more of that is coming around the world. And unfortunately, in the last 10 years, a great deal of that political space has been taken up by authoritarian, right-wing, racist, and anti-Muslim, and so forth ideology. Some would even call it fascism. And I think in some places, like, for instance, with the RSS in India, that's an entirely appropriate designation. But it doesn't have to be only the right that wins. I think that the decline and defeat of a form of liberalism that's existed now for 40 years or so, what's called neoliberalism, could be taken for a kind of very different sort of victory. Like, for instance, if what the Minneapolis City Council announced just last night, the end of reform of police and the beginning of the dismantling of the Minneapolis Police Department, that would be a symbol of such a hope. So let's hope that our conjunctural analysis points us not only towards how we're trapped today by these interactions, but how we might also be able to get out of the iron cage we're in today. And lastly, I'll say a word about your entirely appropriate remark about those magnificent struggles of the First Nations across Canada and indeed across the Americas, the hemisphere, as well as, but with specific reference to the struggles you saw in BC last year. Geoff and I closed the book with some remarks about what we tried to convey was why we regard those Indigenous struggles as so important. As many have pointed out, they're really inspiring for climate activism in particular. And sometimes people who don't really agree, perhaps, will say things like, well, that's just, romanticism. You're just sort of upholding the Indigenous peoples because there's some sort of pre-capitalist society or something like that. It's not really true, though. The specific reason that Indigenous struggles today are so inspiring and important for the climate struggle generally is because Indigenous people for hundreds of years in BC and elsewhere have been fighting against capitalism on one hand and against the sovereignty of colonial states on the other simultaneously. And so they have hundreds of years of experience in dealing with and in having to produce concepts and strategies to confront that particular combination of the form of state sovereignty we associate with the Western state or the colonial state or the settler state on one hand and capitalism on the other. And it's contrary to the popular myth, this has led to many different experiments, political experiments, among different nations and within nations, we might add. Not all Indigenous people are the same politically, not at all. But as a consequence, taken as a whole, this has meant that there are many ways in which those struggles by First Nations suggest to us ways of thinking creatively about how we might simultaneously overcome capitalism and decolonize the world, and therefore produce forms of radical belonging together on this earth that would allow us to address the very deep crisis of the world system that we're in today. And with that, my friend Vin, I must say that I must go, but I thank you very much
so
sincerely
much. I really appreciate
not only for your invitation, but also for your kind words on the book. And if anyone listening to this reads the book and would like to share any thoughts or criticism, Geoff and I would welcome them. Just send us an email. You can find them on the website. Thanks very much, Vin.
Thanks so much, Joel.
My pleasure.
Have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Take care.
You too, bye.
Yeah. So there we are, folks. That's the interview. Now that was a lot in a short period of time. So thanks again to Dr. Wainwright for being a guest here at the Multi-Hazards podcast. Now, a little departure from the norm here. I'm going to give you a summary about the book Climate Leviathan and a few excerpts. So bear with me. So Climate Leviathan, as I said in the podcast, my summer reading last year was this book, at least for a few weeks. Beach and Sand, Lake and Breezes, with Joel Wainwright and Geoff Mann's masterpiece written in 2018, Climate Leviathan, a political theory of our planetary future. So this was among all the climate change related books that I had picked up from my old university's library, which is Simon Fraser University. I had been taking graduate courses online that summer with the University of Waterloo, a school that specializes, among many other subjects, in climate change. So most university books I scan or read, I look at a chapter or two. I don't read the whole thing. But this time I read most of Climate Leviathan. And why? Because this book really spoke to me last summer. And this book, the two authors, they dare to imagine what the future may look like with climate change. Not just the future according to atmospheric or other physical sciences, according to some climate models, but it's the future in terms of who rules the roost and how, and what government will look like, and how we should think about governments and their populations. So in their book, Wainwright and Mann present 4 scenarios. They call it Climate Leviathan is the first one. So this is a capitalist and planetary sovereignty, meaning that basically one world government, all right? But a capitalist one. And then there's Climate Behemoth, which is capitalist, but it is anti-planetary sovereignty. So meaning against one world government, is every nation unto themselves. And then there's Climate Mao, which is non-capitalist with planetary sovereignty, one world government. And then finally, the one that Wainwright and Mann advocate is the last one, Climate X. So this is a non-capitalist and anti-planetary sovereignty movement. So in one June 21st, 2018 article from the Nation's website, Alyssa Battistoni wrote an article. It was called States of Emergency, Imagining a Politics for an Age of Accelerated Climate Change. So it summarized Climate Leviathan as follows. It says, Thomas Hobbes, whose Leviathan, the book Leviathan, remains the fundamental work on the sovereign power that underpins modern states. Hobbes looked at a nation torn asunder by the English Civil War and reckoned that it was better to relinquish one's freedom to the authority of an all-powerful sovereign than to live through such nastiness and brutality. Such a sovereign power did not yet exist in Hobbes' time, but in describing it, Hobbes sought to understand a political form that he thought might soon come into being. Now, Mann and Wainwright argue that we are in another such moment, a time when political forms are in flux, and one can begin to see the shape of the growing Leviathan. They therefore follow Hobbes into a speculative mode, describing the forms of power they think are likely to emerge in the future, while recognizing that none have done so yet. Their other key resource in thinking about this Leviathan is the German political theorist and Nazi sympathizer Karl Schmitt, who draws on Hobbes in constructing his own theory of sovereignty. Everyday decision-making is governed by law, Schmitt argues, but sovereignty is to be found in the moments when emergency demands extra-legal action. For Schmitt, it was crucial that the sovereign be able to take action against a community's enemies as it deemed necessary. Sovereignty here consists of the political power that allows a state to override the law in defense of its friends. As with Hobbes, people accept this extreme form of rule in exchange for protection. The left rediscovered Schmitt during the Bush years, when, as the Italian theorist Giorgio Agamben noted, a state of exception had, under the guise of the amorous War on Terror, became the norm. But this view of the state has rarely been extended to thinking about the kind of emergency politics that will arise as a result of climate change. Drawing on Hobbes and Schmitt, the authors begin to do this work. Climate Leviathan imagines how ecological disruption will create the conditions for a new sovereign authority. So that's the end of the article. So let's just take a look at some of these scenarios in a little bit of depth. So in the book Climate Leviathan, on page 38, Wainwright and Mann explain what is Leviathan. So they say, why call this Leviathan? Climate Leviathan is a direct descendant from Hobbes' original to Schmitt's sovereign. When it comes to climate, Leviathan will decide and is constituted precisely in the act of decision. It expresses a desire for and the recognition of the necessity of a planetary sovereign to seize command, declare an emergency, and bring order to the earth, all in the name of saving life. Now, let me just repeat again. Planetary sovereign here, it basically means a one world government. Now, Wainwright and Mann, they go on to say, Climate Leviathan could perpetuate the extant rule of northern liberal democratic capitalist states, meaning Europe and America and all their friends. Now here's where it gets super interesting. So they say, we think the most likely scenario, as they elaborate in chapters 5 and 6, is that through the coming decades, the waning United States-led liberal capitalist bloc will collaborate with China, can you imagine, to create a planetary regime that, in light of political and ecological crises, will brook no opposition in defense of a human future for which it volunteers itself as the first and last line of defense. The pattern of mobilization will likely be familiar, in which the United Nations or other international fora will serve as a means of legitimizing aggressive means of surveillance and discipline. So this could make the construction of a climate Leviathan a key means by which to salvage American hegemony. So that's a prospect that only increases the likelihood of its consolidations. And I'm like, wow, the US and China in bed? Now, it may have seemed like a possibility back in 2016 and 17, but now, after the last couple of years, both nations are at each other's throats. And it looks like the decades of collaboration between the two countries is breaking up like river ice on a Yukon, Canada landscape in spring. But the authors go on to state that the Paris Agreement of December 2015 is a legal and political foreshadowing of Climate Leviathan's form. So the authors see the Paris Accord as a massive failure. They say, the critical element here is the goal of the agreement, to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks in the second half of the century. So this seems to suggest that the world will be carbon neutral sometime between 2050 and 2100. This is improbable at best, at odds with the present trajectory, and impossible to square with the lack of language on fossil fuels. So that's the Paris Accord. So Pablo Anzalón, former Bolivian ambassador to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, ridiculed the gap between rhetoric and action, stating, thanks to the contributions of emission reductions presented in Paris, global emissions of greenhouse gases that in 2012 were 53 gigatons CO2e, which means carbon dioxide equivalents. It's a measurement tool used for comparing various greenhouse gas emissions. So they will continue to climb up to around 60 gigatons CO2e by 2030. If governments really want to limit the temperature increase to less than 2 degrees Celsius, they should commit to reduce global emissions to 35 gigatons of CO2e by 2030. So that's like almost half. Governments know this and yet do the opposite and even shout, "Victory! Yeah! The planet is saved!" Is this not a particular type of schizophrenia? So the two authors, they go on to quote Canadian author and activist Naomi Klein. She says, it's like going, I acknowledge that I will die of a heart attack if I don't radically lower my blood pressure. I therefore will exercise once a week, eat 4 hamburgers instead of 5, and you have to call me a hero because I've never done this before and you have no idea how lazy I used to be. Okay? But the Wainwright and Mann, they say the Paris Accord is not a mistake because they said it constitutes a new international law created by elite representatives of the world's nation states. So the agreement itself is a contradiction. It admits that the global average temperature will not be kept to below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which is necessary to save life as we know it in anything similar to our present. So what is the contradiction here? The world's elites recognize these contradictions, and although they are by no means agreed on what to do, they're trying to address them without limiting conditions that cause them to fail. The principal failure is that the Paris Agreement does not keep fossil fuels in the ground. Thus, this method is where institutional means that are currently available to capitalist liberal democracy make sorry attempts at consensus in order to appear legitimate to democratic nations. And this is where we're currently headed. So that's Climate Leviathan. Now let's go on to Climate Mao. So Climate Mao, they say, is marked by the emergence of a non-capitalist authority along Maoist lines. Mao Zedong, who was the founder of the People's Republic of China in 1949. If capitalist Climate Leviathan stands ready to embrace carbon governance in an evolving Euro-American liberal hegemony, Climate Mao expresses the necessity of a just terror in the interests of the future of the collective, which is to say that it represents the necessity of a planet sovereign, one world government, but wields this power against capital. The state of exception determines who may or may not emit carbon at the expense of unjust wastefulness, unnecessary emissions, and conspicuous consumption. So, for example, economist Min-Chi Lee speculates that a new revolution in the Chinese Revolution, a re-energization of the Maoist political tradition, could transform China and save humanity from doom if an anti-capitalist planetary sovereign is to emerge that could change the world's climate trajectory. It is most likely to emerge in China. Even today, when an increasingly non-Maoist Chinese state invokes its full regulatory authority, it can achieve political feats unimaginable in liberal democracy. So that was Climate Mao. Now let's move on to Climate Behemoth. Behemoth provides at least two possible mass-based responses to Leviathan. One, reactionary populism, and two, revolutionary anti-state democracy. So in its reactionary form, where populism rallies to capital, Climate Behemoth stands in opposition to Climate Leviathan's planetary sovereignty, one world government. It's not hard to find evidence of this reactionary tendency today, epitomized in the continued influence of climate change denial in mainstream political discourse, especially in the United States. The Millerian variety of this formation embraces an ideological structure that renders it impervious to reason. Now let me just say, I looked up millenarian. So this is, it means belief in Christian prophecy. That is, predictions for the future, I suppose, in the Bible, in a coming 1,000 year of peace where the world is ruled by Jesus himself. So that's millenarian. Okay, so let me read that sentence again. The millenarian variety of this formation embraces an ideological structure that renders it impervious to reason. Indeed, that is the point. The disproportionate influence of this proudly unreasonable minority, agitated by the ill-gotten riches of a handful, will persist at least for a while. So, the text says, the authors, they discuss this right-wing populist movement that has risen in the last couple decades. So they say, from India to Brazil, Turkey to Egypt, Russia to England, and the United States, the successful transmission of populist energies has pulled capitalist states to the right. They go on to say, today's behemoth substitutes free market nationalist and evangelical rhetoric for explanation. It is truly reactionary, even in its milder manifestation, where the fact of climate change is acknowledged but posited as beyond our control because of human or non-human nature. Reaction dominates the chorus of ridicule aimed at alarmists calling for political economic reorganization to address environmental change. So these rational behemoths, though less self-obsessed and misanthropic than their millenarian associates who affirm that if the world is coming to an end, it must be God's will. So they condemn the regulatory hubris of climate science no less vigorously. So to put it in our terms, Behemoth hates Mao for its faith in secular revolution. But Leviathan, and they hate Leviathan for its liberal pretension to rational world government, and both for their willingness to sacrifice liberty for lower carbon emissions. But many other powerful actors who oppose Leviathan, including massive segments of the natural resource sector, would welcome transnational cooperation in other spheres, like defense. They dismiss the threat of climate change and international regulation in the name of an unfettered capitalist market. This means climate behemoth founded on two not necessarily commensurable principles. In the United States, the signature affiliations of the reactionary right, market fetishism, cheap energy, white nationalism, firearms, evangelical faith, buttress reactionary behemoth. The result is an opportunistic but contradictory and unstable blend of fundamentalisms: the security of the homeland, the freedom of the market, and the justice of God. The authors say that the new form of global governance could be capitalist or post-capitalist. So number one, a U.S.-centered climate leviathan. So in this scenario, the United States, it maintains its current military dominance and exploits the need to save life on the earth as the ideological basis of a new imperial hegemony. The United States is not the global leader in the technologies of destruction. It's not only the global leader in the technologies of destruction, but also of geoengineering, particularly SRM. And SRM means solar radiation management or solar geoengineering. Number two, the second scenario emerges if we begin by recognizing that the United States is not, in fact, globally hegemonic. For example, if we do not assume that the United States alone is likely to achieve rapid advances in military technology like space weaponry. On the contrary, the United States is already competing with several other capitalist nation states for quote-unquote great power status, most notably China, but also Russia, India, and others. And this competition already involves a new Cold War of cyber warfare, diplomatic conflict, and the race to develop sophisticated weaponry, including space weapons. So in this scenario, which seems more likely, one or more of these competing powers will continue to compete with the United States. History would seem to suggest that this will lead to war, and it may well. But for our purposes, what is critical is that the United States would fail to establish political, military, and technological dominance. The implication is that the management of the planet would unfold in the context of a world system that is neither democratic, since the vast majority of nation states and peoples would have no real involvement in the important decisions about the Earth's management, nor clearly dominated by one hegemonic power. Planetary governance would unroll on a lumpy, conflictual geopolitical terrain upon which elites continue to seek adaptations, quote-unquote, that meet their needs: political stability, continued accumulation, and so on. For example, it does not seem entirely outrageous to imagine the United States and China, or some other small cohort of globally influential powers, deciding to reorganize the world system in a sort of grand compromise that includes shared planetary management, like a G2 concentration of the existing order bilaterally constituted to save life on Earth. So from the perspective of anyone hoping for something like climate justice, none of these future paths or variations upon them are acceptable. So moving on. Climate X. We want an open, just future for those to come, particularly the descendants of the world's less powerful. But this future is so undeniably bleak, and the world's present political arrangements so undemocratic, that any informed, rational response is likely to pull us toward Climate Leviathan, because the future consolidation and expansion of extant power structures would seem to be the only structures of scale, scope, and authority even close to adequate to the challenge of climate change. So Climate X is a world that has defeated the emergent Climate Leviathan and its compulsion toward planetary sovereignty while also transcending capitalism. So Wainwright and Mann, they propose at least 3 principles that can serve as the foundation for movements that become Climate X. So the first is equality. The planetary ecological crisis illuminates another. If we are truly equal, then we share the earth. No one can own it. Number 2, dignity. So this is inclusion and dignity of all. So democracy is not just majority rule. It's not majority rule, and it has little to do with the vote. Rather, democracy exists in a society to the extent that anyone and everyone could rule, could shape collective answers to collective questions. So no nation state today meets this criterion. This demands a struggle for inclusion and dignity that can enhance our capacity to transform the politics of rule, a great collective attempt to create conditions for the realization of our self-determination. The third principle is solidarity in composing a world of many worlds. Now this is from a Spanish, I believe it's a Spanish phrase from the Mexican Zapatistas, which stresses the dignity of others, belonging, and common struggle, as well as the importance of laughter, dancing, and raising the next generation. So these 3 principles, equality, dignity, and solidarity, from some of the world's most marginal social groups, many of whom unsurprisingly are indigenous communities, have led the voracious opposition to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which you mentioned before, the UNFCCC, conception of climate politics, because indigenous people see it as capitalist imperialism's talent show, and with respect to its capacity to mitigate the impacts of catastrophic climate change, they think it's a meaningless liberal piety. So these courageous movements, and some seemingly little more than chaotic, are the seeds of Climate X. And so this is proof that it is germinating. So they, again, quote economist Ming-Chi Lee stating, ultimately, climate stabilization can only be achieved if the great majority of the world's population, not just the elites and the ecologically conscious middle class and individuals, understand the implications. They relate these implications to their own lives and actively participate in the global effort of stabilization. So the essential question is, how could we create conditions in which these dynamics actually operate? Although time is clearly short, the immediate challenge is one of cultivation, of working the material and ideological ground in which these movements can bloom as rapidly as possible and in their full multiplicity. So cultivation like that, it requires the kind of radical struggle that proves history wrong. A world revolution for climate justice has no clear historical precedent, which is to say that if Lee is right, that climate stabilization can only be achieved if the great majority of the world's population understand the implications, relate these implications to their own lives, and actively and consciously participate in the global effort of stabilization, we have no previous model to go by. We must build the means to render global participation possible while the entire globe is changing, warming, and potentially warring. Yeah, that means like having a war. And all of this has to happen in a world that is moving fast in the wrong direction. So Mann and Wainwright, they look at three challenges. They say first, from the vantage point of Climate Leviathan, Climate X is impossible by definition. The most powerful capitalist nations are China and the United States of America, and both of these see climate justice movements and their aims as pipe dreams. There would have to be revolutionary events in both nation states, but also forms of radical transnationalism relaying struggles within and between them. So we're a long way from this. At best, we have limited forms of solidarity expressed sporadically and typically filtered through nationalistic lenses. So the problem with every attempt to realize particular local instances of climate X is that upon reaching a minimal level of viability and visibility, every X will be surrounded and attacked by capitalist nation states and their privately organized allies. So how can we build solidaristic protection above and beyond the capitalist state except through some other state form, ideally a world state? So this gets a little complicated. And they use the example of, say, the Zapatistas in Mexico basically being surrounded by the Mexican military, supported by the United States and other powerful states. So their second challenge that Wainwright and Mann talk about, they say that this leads to the second limitation to Climate X from the position of a would-be Climate Mao. Within any climate justice movement that could possibly be effective or radical, we will encounter a deep desire for a planetary sovereign, a one-world government, one capable of the emergency measures needed to save life on Earth. So from this vantage, Climate X is too democratic, it's too anti-sovereign. There's much to celebrate in the burgeoning worldwide resistance to fossil fuel corporations and the exciting radical challenges to neoliberal orthodoxy and political pessimism that dominate ideological landscape. But in the face of rapid climate change, many people on the left, they've become convinced that something like Climate Leviathan is our only hope. Democracy as we know it, especially in its hegemonic liberal variety, seems profoundly inadequate to the problems that lie ahead. And to imagine that democracy in another form is going to fix things takes what many might justifiably see as an increasingly ludicrous leap of faith. Third challenge. From the position of behemoth, fear of its chaos will be one of the main forces that breathes life into Leviathan. For while liberalism has little fear of climate change per se, it dreads the mob, the rabble, the climate refugee. These figures threaten to destroy not only the bourgeoisie, the global elite, but the entire order it understands as civilization. So, in the book, pages 61 and 62, Wainwright and Mann quote John Holdren, assistant to the United States President for Science and Technology in 2010, who spoke before the U.S. National Climate Adaptation Summit and stated, we only have three options. Number one, the first is mitigation. The steps we take to reduce the pace and magnitude of the changes in climate that our activities cause. Number two, the second is adaptation. The measures we take to reduce the harm that results from climate change that we do not avoid. And number three, the third option is suffering. It's really that simple. Mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. So there you have it. That's Climate Leviathan in a nutshell. I hope I've done it justice. And let me just repeat at the end of this the four scenarios. Climate Leviathan is capitalistic and basically one world government. Climate Behemoth is capitalistic and it's non-one world government. It's like a bunch of nation states continuing to fight, which kind of sounds like now, huh? And then Climate Mao, non-capitalistic and one world government. and Climate X, non-capitalistic, and non-one world government. So yes, as I was saying, I hope I've done justice to Dr. Joel Wainwright and Dr. Geoff Mann's book, Climate Leviathan. But I find that at the end of the day, I really want maybe them or other people to just take this and run with it. I think that this is a start of a conversation we need to have about future scenarios. Because, for example, in the field of disaster risk reduction, and I said this in my first podcast about multi-hazards, we need to imagine things that could happen. Because, for example, in emergency management, they do what they call exercises. Basically, they're drills. And so they get a bunch of people together, and then they'll like burn a car, and firefighters they'll put the fire out of the car, and they're practicing basically. And then, for example, in the city of Vancouver here, we had a huge earthquake drill or exercise that was saying, okay, what will all the agencies do if there's an earthquake? Now, with the concept of multi-hazards, you will have more than one hazard or disaster happening at the same time, or it could be consecutive, but it's like a domino effect. So we need to look out into the future. Climate change, not just the physical science of it, but we need to look at what's going to be happening with our governments, what's going to be happening with our society and our populations. And we need to imagine different scenarios. Now, it could be somebody who's what they call a climate fiction writer, or what do they call it? Cli-fi, climate fiction. Somebody who just goes out and writes science fiction books and just imagines. But we need to get our brain out there into thinking, because then perhaps we can pinpoint something and say, yeah, this is likely, and we can prepare for it. We can prepare for different scenarios, different examples of what the future will lead. And I think we owe that to our kids, instead of, as we say in English, getting caught with our pants down and totally embarrassed, losing face because we haven't prepared. And in some ways, COVID-19, there were pandemic plans, there were pandemic drills or exercises that had been done before, but at the end of the day, it looks like a lot of nation states, they weren't prepared. The world wasn't prepared for climate-19. That's right, for COVID-19. Now we've got climate 20. It's going to become climate 21, climate 22. Climate change is the long-term problem. And my hope is that the youth who are campaigning on Fridays and they were instigating these climate strikes worldwide, I'm hoping that once COVID-19 kind of fades a bit, that these protests and this political pressure about not just climate change mitigation, but also adaptation will continue. So at the end of this podcast, I'd like to make a little disclaimer, and I add it to the end of each podcast. As this podcast episode is meant to be educational and does not try to offer legal, medical, or other specific advice unless otherwise noted. Also, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations that the host, that's me, Vin Nelson, or guests are part of. So here, as I wrap up this episode, I thank each one of you, my listeners, for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay tuned for more. This is Vin Nelson wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.